Hi bookworms, this is the part where I try and get all deep and meaningful about books with the Novel Thoughts Book Club, and I will be talking about this one. Yeah. So I don't have much to say about this book because it's short, it's sweet, it's predominantly lighthearted and funny. One of the main things that I picked up on in this book is the concept of the theme of social isolation and ostracism. There's some Scrabble words for you. The blurb of the book, at least on my copy, does actually describe the main characters as a colourful blend of misfits, which I think is absolutely perfect in describing the characters in the book and the main struggles that they all contend with at some point throughout the book, which is definitely the concept of isolation. First up, the setting of this book is already quite isolated in and of itself. The book is set just after the time of the Great Depression, about a street that is still very much in the throes of that depression period. So the people there are already isolated in that they're poor, they're still stuck trying to find work and find money to keep living. The rest of the world is moving on and starting to recover from the depression, but Cannery Row has very much been left behind. So already talking about a community that is isolated from the very get-go. There are a few sort of debates that people have about what Steinbeck might have made as his point about this, because he writes about these people that are very poor, that are struggling very much, but he writes about them with this warm-hearted grace that I've already talked about. This book is so funny, the characters are beautiful, the characters are so delightfully quirky, they're all kind-hearted, they're all warm, they all have this sort of tight-knit community that they find in the midst of their isolation from everywhere else and in the midst of their poverty and their struggles. So many people have tried to describe this as like a utopian book, where he talks about the fact that being well off does not necessarily guarantee happiness as much as finding a community will. And I think in part that is true because, like I said, a lot of the characters throughout this tiny little, not really story, struggle with a point at which they feel more isolated and more ostracized than the rest of the time, and so there is that battle with feeling isolated and with trying to come back to the community afterwards. That being said, there are a lot of very depressing points in this book that are brushed over very quickly, but they're definitely there. Multiple background characters commit suicide. I don't know how much to say without being spoilery, but there's definitely some dark stuff going on in this book on top of the supposed utopian nature of the story. But let's talk a little bit more about the actual characters and the isolations and the struggles that they come across. First up is Doc, and Doc is kind of the center of the community. He's the one that everyone goes to for advice, he's the one that everyone goes to for comfort, he's always throwing parties, he's always helping people out. That is the reason why people are trying to throw a party for him in the duration of this story, is because they want to find a way to say thank you for him for being such a gentle and kind-hearted soul. That being said, Steinbeck is very quick to counter that with a little bit of a sad anecdote about Doc, which is that in spite of his friendliness and his friends, Doc was a lonely and a set-apart man. In a group, Doc always seemed alone. When the lights were on and the curtains drawn and the Gregorian music played from the great phonograph, Mack used to look down on the laboratory from the palace flophouse. He knew Doc had a girl in there, but Mack used to get a dreadful feeling of loneliness out of it. Even in the dear close contact with a girl, Mack felt that Doc would be lonely. Doc was a night crawler. The lights were on in the lab all night, and yet he seemed to be up in the daytime too. And the great shouts of music came out of the lab at any time of the day or night. So even though Doc is the center of the community and he's always throwing parties for people, Doc feels isolation more than almost anyone else in this story. He is set apart, he is constantly lonely even in the company of people, and I'll talk about this more at the end of the video, but this feeling of isolation that Doc feels even when surrounded by people who love him dearly is something that comes to the forefront at the end of the novel. Next up is Mack and the boys. This is a group of people that live in the palace flophouse that was in the quote that I just talked to you about. And these guys come across the more plot-driven sense of isolation in it. They do something that the community decides they're not happy with, and they get kind of ostracized at some point in the book and then have to fight to overcome that alongside the party throwing thing. So their storyline actually provides some very good quotes about the nature of ostracism and isolation and what it can do to the human soul, if you want to call it that. It says, "Socially, Mack and the boys were beyond the pale. They drew into themselves, and no one could foresee how they would come out of the cloud. For there are two possible reactions to social ostracism. Either a man emerges determined to be better, purer, and kindlier, or he goes bad, challenges the world, and does even worse things. This last is by far the commonest reaction to the stigma." So like I said, Steinbeck kind of uses the storyline of Mack and the boys to really bring the concept of social ostracism to the foreground. I won't say too much because I am trying to keep these kind of spoiler free. So yeah, definitely a very strong theme in the novel. I think it is interesting to note that he says that the commonest reaction to being ostracized is to challenge it and to become bad and to not even bother trying to make people think that they're good anymore. This is not what Mack and the boys do. So he's suggesting that the Mack and the boys are in the minority of people with true hearts of gold, shall we say, wherein they encounter this feeling of isolation because of something that they did, and the only thing that they want to do is try and make it better and to be able to join the community again better and purer than before. And I think this might tie back into that concept of utopia that other people say is a really strong theme in the book, which is that even though they're poor, even though they never do wells, even though they don't have a house, they don't have proper jobs, and they often try and do good things and it fails, they're all truly warm-hearted and pure-hearted people who will do anything that they can to come back into the community that they know and love, because that is the most common theme of the book, is that poverty does not necessarily mean that you have less in the world than anyone else. In fact, sometimes it can mean that you have things that are more valuable. The final thing to talk about is the ending. So in the final chapters, they finally do throw a party for Doc, and it is a complete and utter success. But at some point during the party, Doc reads out a love poem to everyone. And then the next morning when he wakes up with a hangover from the poem, which is the final chapter, he's cleaning up, doing the dishes and things, and rereading the poem and thinking it to himself in a very poetic manner, of course, and he gets tears in his eyes thinking about this poem, and just very over-emotional in general. And that is kind of how the story ends, and you can't tell whether he's getting emotional because he still feels isolated, or whether he's getting emotional because he is so touched by the people around him who have reached out to him to show him that they know how much he cares for their community. I read someone else's opinion was that this might be a bit of a word of warning, especially in combination with the previous chapter, which is completely unrelated, about a gopher that builds a burrow trying to find a female mate and doesn't succeed in finding a female mate. So they argued that this might have been a bit of an ominous sign for Doc and his feeling of isolation still as a lonely and set apart man, that perhaps reading the love poem has reminded him that even after all of this, he's struggling to find someone that he truly connects with and wants to share his life with, and that the community that he's built for himself may not actually be, in spite of all of its seeming perfections, in spite of the fact that it comes across as a utopia, it may not necessarily provide the things that Doc himself personally wants to have provided for him. And perhaps the reason why he's getting emotional at the end in this final chapter is because of his slowly realizing that. So that is kind of like the darker interpretation of the end of the novel, that after all of this talk about Cannery Row as a potential utopia, that it's not enough for Doc. I don't really know what else to say about that. If that is the case, that's definitely a very sort of conflicting ending, and that is why I walked away feeling a little bit disheartened and disappointed by the ending of the book. So there you go. Definitely concepts of how to overcome isolation, what it feels like to be ostracized and isolated and set apart and lonely, and also lots of sort of subtle, crafty ways at implying that the most important thing above all else is a sense of community. Above money, above well-being, above success, the most important thing for you is always to have people around you who love you and who look after you and who support you and will provide that sense of community for you.